The cabin of American Airlines Flight 847 hummed with the ordinary rhythms of a cross-country journey, a sound Margaret Chen had heard so many times over the decades that it had become almost like a metronome for her life. The steady thrum of the engines, the occasional hydraulic whisper, the faint rush of recirculated air that always made her think of something between a hospital and a tomb. She'd taken this flight, this exact route from San Francisco to Denver 247 times. She kept count, not obsessively, just accurately. The 737 had pushed off from SFO at 2:15 p.m. Pacific Time, and now at 4:47 p.m. the California coastline was disappearing beneath a blanket of winter clouds. Margaret sat in seat 12C, a window seat, always a window seat, with her forehead pressed gently against the cool plexiglass. Her silver hair, cut short and practical, fell in a neat line along her jawline. She wore a faded navy windbreaker over a cream-colored cardigan, the kind of outfit that made her invisible to people. Forgettable, safe. That was intentional. She'd spent 47 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable. In her lap lay a copy of The Remains of the Day, its spine cracked from a dozen previous readings. Kazuo Ishiguro had always understood something about people who buried themselves in duty and silence. Margaret had read this book once every 3 years for nearly 2 decades. It was comforting, in a way, reading about a man who'd made his peace with a life of service and restraint, who convinced himself that suppressing his own desires was nobility. That she understood. The passenger next to her, a businessman who'd barely made it to his seat before the cabin doors closed, had ordered a whiskey at 2:45 p.m. and was now on his third, tapping away at his laptop with the aggressive efficiency of someone trying to prove something. Margaret had learned long ago not to notice people, not to engage, not to create memories of herself in others' minds. She was excellent at being forgotten. Her granddaughter Emma had called that morning before she left for the airport. "You're coming to the wedding, right, Grandma? You promised." Of course she was coming. She'd been looking forward to it in the quiet way she looked forward to most things, without excess emotion, with the simple knowledge that duty and love were sometimes the same thing. Emma was marrying a good man, a kind man. The wedding would be beautiful. Margaret would sit in the third row, wear something appropriate, and feel the particular ache that came from watching your granddaughter's happiness while thinking of your own daughter, Emma's mother, who'd grown up without her father. That ache never really went away. She'd learned to carry it like a suitcase she'd checked but never intended to retrieve. The flight attendant, a young woman with the kind of practiced cheerfulness that Margaret recognized as a survival mechanism in service work, had approached with the beverage cart an hour into the flight. "Can I get you something, ma'am?" Margaret had ordered water with lemon, a choice so predictable it was practically invisible. The attendant barely registered her request before moving on. "Perfect." Margaret had paid for her ticket with a credit card attached to a bank account under her real name, Margaret Chen, because pretending to be someone else would have required documents she didn't possess and a lie she couldn't maintain. But nothing about her appearance, her demeanor, her choices suggested anything remarkable. A retired librarian, traveling to visit family. That's what the metadata would say about her. That's what anyone looking at her would conclude. No one needed to know anything else. She opened her book to the page she'd marked, Chapter 8, where Stevens was reflecting on a conversation he'd had years before, where he might have been happy if he'd only chosen differently. The prose was elegant, measured, devastating in its quiet way. Margaret had always been drawn to stories about people who lived in restraint, who kept their mouths shut, who believed that silence was a form of honor. Outside the window, the clouds had turned that particular shade of gray-white that meant they were at cruising altitude, that the ground was now too far below to see, that they existed in a kind of suspended nowhere. Margaret found this comforting. Flying had always felt like a pause in time, a place where normal rules didn't apply, where you existed in some space between your old life and your new one, in the neutral territory of the sky. That's why she'd stopped flying 47 years ago. The sky had too many memories. The businessman next to her stood to use the restroom, and she shifted slightly, giving herself an inch more space. The plane was maybe 70% full, mostly business travelers and holiday passengers. A young mother with a toddler several rows back. An elderly couple holding hands in the back. The normal demographic of a Wednesday cross-country flight. Margaret was the only person on this plane carrying a classified secret. She didn't think about it often anymore. The training had been very good, the kind of psychological compartmentalization that the government excels at teaching. You learn to lock a door in your mind and not open it. You learn to live a normal life on top of the life that ended. You learn to smile at your grandchildren and not think about what you're not telling them. You learn to volunteer at the library and donate to charity, and take the same walk every morning, and convince yourself that this is a normal life. For 47 years, it had worked. The pilots had been cruising at 35,000 feet for exactly 2 hours when something changed. Captain Michael Richards, 44 years old, 32 years of experience, no incidents on his record, glanced at his instruments with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Everything was nominal. Weather was clear to the east. The autopilot held them perfectly centered in their flight corridor. He was thinking about his daughter's Christmas recital, about whether he'd make it back to Los Angeles in time. The radio crackled. Not the usual clear, professional chatter of Denver air traffic control. Not the routine frequency where pilots chatted about wind speeds and vectors and approach procedures. This was something else. Unknown civilian traffic. This is Kingfish 17, a calm male voice transmitted, crisp and authoritative. Military frequency. Military discipline. We have 2 F-35 Lightnings 10 miles off your right wing, confirming passenger manifest, specifically requesting eyes on seat 12C. Richard's stomach dropped like he'd just hit an air pocket. This never happened. Not in his career. Not on commercial flights. Not without warning or emergency alert. Kingfish 17, this is American 847, he responded, hearing the slight tension creep into his own voice despite his training. We have no security alerts. Say again, your purpose. A pause. The kind of pause that means someone on the other end is checking with higher authority, getting permission to say something that shouldn't be said. Captain, we've been asked to relay a message to your passenger in 12C. Tell her that the call sign, Widow 6, has been activated. First time in 47 years. They're expecting her on the tarmac in Denver. Margaret didn't hear the transmission. She was reading about Stevens walking through a moonlit English garden, reflecting on a life of discipline and restraint, wondering if he'd made the right choices. The prose was so lovely, so heartbreaking, that it had pulled her completely into its world. She didn't notice when the businessman returned from the restroom, didn't notice when the flight attendant disappeared into the galley with a peculiar urgency. What she did notice was the feeling. It started as a pressure in her chest, not painful but present. A pressure change in the cabin. No, the instruments would have alerted the crew. A pressure change in her own body. More than that. It was the feeling she'd learned to recognize decades ago, the one she'd trained herself not to feel, recognition. The moment when a ghost you'd successfully buried decides to crawl out of the ground. The stewardess appeared beside her seat, flustered in a way that broke her practiced composure. Ms. Chen, I'm so sorry to bother you, but the captain needs you to come to the cockpit. Right now, it's important. Margaret set down her book slowly, carefully marking her place. Her hands didn't shake. They'd been trained not to. That discipline, that control, it had been drilled into her at 17 years old, and it had never left. She stood, steadied herself against the armrest, and looked down at the flight attendant with quiet eyes. How long? Margaret asked softly. Ma'am. How long has he been waiting to reach me? The flight attendant didn't understand the question. Margaret moved past her and walked toward the cockpit, each step measured and deliberate, like she was walking through museum galleries instead of an airplane aisle. She could feel people watching her. She could feel the atmosphere of the cabin shifting, the way it does when something fundamentally wrong has entered the space. The cockpit door opened. Captain Richards stood with his hand on the frame, seeing in her face, really seeing her for perhaps the first time, that whatever this was, whatever had just activated, he was in the presence of someone who'd been waiting 4 decades for this moment. Margaret stepped inside. Richards gestured toward the right window. She looked out. 2 sleek gray fighter jets held perfect formation just 500 feet away, moving in absolute synchronization with the 737. She could see the tail codes, the paint jobs, the unmistakable silhouette that she'd only ever seen in photographs and simulator screens now decades old. F-35 Sea Lightning II, naval variant. "Ms. Chen," Captain Richards began, his voice carefully professional even though he clearly had no professional framework for this situation. "I don't know what this is, but I've been flying for 32 years, and I've never experienced anything like." "How old are you?" Margaret interrupted, not turning from the window. 49, ma'am." "Then you weren't born the last time those jets escorted me anywhere." She said it like someone stating a fact about the weather, but her reflection in the window showed everything else. Her jaw clenched tight, her eyes gone cold and distant, like she just crossed a threshold from one reality into another entirely. The radio crackled again, and Margaret Chen heard a call sign she'd buried 47 years ago, and she understood that her life as Margaret the librarian was over. The cockpit was cramped, smaller than most people would imagine, a space designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Margaret stood in the narrow passage between the pilot seats, Captain Richards to her left, First Officer David Patterson to her right. Both men were staring at her now, with the kind of mixture of confusion and dawning realization that came from understanding, on some level, that they just made contact with something far larger than routine air traffic. 2 fighter jets held position outside the window. 2 F-35 Sea Lightning IIs, the Navy's most advanced multi-role stealth aircraft. They were positioned at a perfect 500-foot distance off the right wing, close enough that Margaret could see the details. The smooth curve of the canopies, the weapons' hardpoints, the subtle imperfections in the paint that proved they were real, not some kind of optical illusion her mind was generating to process the impossible. The radio crackled again. Richards glanced at Margaret, silently asking for permission to respond. She'd known he would. Authority recognized authority, even when it was no longer official. She nodded once. "Kingfish 17, American 847. Passenger has been informed. Awaiting further instruction," Richards transmitted, his voice steady despite the rapid dilation of his pupils, despite the sweat Margaret could see forming on his temples. The response came immediately, and this time there was something different in the military pilot's voice. Not just protocol, not just the professional detachment of military procedure. There was something underneath, a current of respect or maybe awe. "Roger that, American 847. Kingfish 17 will maintain escort to Denver. And Captain," a pause, just long enough for everyone in the cockpit to understand that what was about to be said was significant. "Tell Widow 6 that the whole squadron honors her. We know who she is. We've always known who she is." The call sign hung in the air like a ghost that had just been given a name. Margaret gripped the armrest between the pilot's seats so hard that her knuckles turned white. 47 years. She'd spent nearly half a century trying to disappear into the ordinary world. A retired librarian in Santa Fe, New Mexico. A woman who'd taken the same morning walk along Alameda Street every single day for 23 years straight. The same route, the same time, 6:47 a.m. every morning, predictable as sunrise. A grandmother who baked sourdough bread from scratch twice a week. A volunteer at the public library who'd read to elementary school children every Thursday afternoon for the past 15 years. A woman who donated to public radio, who attended the UU Church on Canyon Road, who'd cultivated such an aggressively normal life that she'd almost convinced herself it was real. But some call signs don't stay buried. Some names, once spoken into the radio, crack the entire foundation of a carefully constructed existence. "What's your name, Captain?" she asked quietly, not looking away from the jets outside the window. "Richards, ma'am, Michael Richards." "And how many years have you been flying, Captain Richards?" 32 years, like I said." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and what he saw in her eyes made him take half a step backward despite himself. "Then you've been flying your entire professional life during an era of relative peace, Captain. You've never had to eject over hostile territory. You've never had to choose between two impossible options in the space of 3 seconds. You've never had to make a decision knowing that whatever you chose, someone you loved would die, that it's just a question of who." She turned back to the window. "That's the difference, you see, between someone who's flown in peace and someone who's flown in war." First Officer Patterson made a small sound, not quite a gasp, but close. "Ma'am," Richard said carefully, and Margaret could hear the calculation in his voice, the way he was reassessing everything about her. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. That call sign, Widow 6, what does it mean?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the F-35s held their perfect formation, 2 pilots who'd been waiting for this moment their entire careers. "It means I was the only female pilot in an engagement that the government decided never happened," she said finally. "It means I flew F-4 Phantoms in 1976 for the United States Navy. It means I shot down enemy aircraft in a sortie that was classified so high that most people don't even know it occurred. And it means that 2 men died that day, and I survived. And the government told everyone involved to forget about it and go on with their lives." Richards and Patterson exchanged a look, the kind of look that pilots exchange when they've just realized they're transporting someone whose historical significance they didn't even know they were in the presence of. "The F-4, Patterson said slowly, was discontinued from Navy service in 1987. You're telling us you flew?" "In 1976, Margaret confirmed. "Which means I was born in 1946 or earlier, which means I'm 78 or older, which means the government kept me secret for nearly half a century and no one, not a single person in the intelligence community or the military, was authorized to acknowledge my existence." She pressed her hand against the window, her palm flat against the cool plexiglass. "Those pilots out there," she said softly, "they grew up after I disappeared. They learned their trade in an era when I was already supposed to be erased from history, and yet somehow they know my call sign. They know my name, which means someone very high up in the Navy decided it was time to stop forgetting." Richards picked up the radio with a question in his eyes. Margaret nodded again. "Kingfish 17, American 847. The passenger in 12C requests clarification. What is your authorization for this contact? Who ordered the intercept?" The pause that followed was longer than the previous ones, long enough that Margaret knew the pilot was consulting with someone above his pay grade, long enough that she understood whatever was happening, it had come from an official level. When the response came, the pilot's voice had changed. It was younger now, more urgent, tinged with emotion that a professional military pilot shouldn't have allowed to crack through. "Captain Richards, we have direct authorization from Admiral Patricia Houston, current Chief of Naval Operations. Tell Widow 6 that Admiral Houston sends her personal regards, and tell her that the F-35 program she helped pioneer, the one she gave her husband's life for, has evolved beyond anything we thought possible in 1976. She should be proud." Margaret's legs nearly buckled. Admiral Patricia Houston. She'd known Patty in 1976. knew her as Lieutenant Commander Patricia Houston, a brilliant tactical officer who'd been one of the few people in the intelligence community who'd known the truth about the engagement. One of the few people who'd testified, privately, in classified chambers, about what really happened that day. Patricia had always believed Margaret deserved better than silence, had always believed that James Chen's death deserved acknowledgement. And now, after nearly 5 decades of bureaucratic silence, Admiral Patricia Houston, the highest-ranking woman in Navy history, Margaret realized with a sudden flush of understanding, was using her authority to reach across time and pull Margaret back into the light. "My granddaughter is getting married in 3 weeks in Denver," Margaret heard herself say, her voice sounding strange and distant. "That's where I'm going. I need to know if those pilots are going to follow us to her wedding venue, or if we can have 5 minutes to pretend this is a normal life. If we can have just one more day where I'm still a librarian instead of whatever I'm about to become." Richards reached out and put a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture that probably violated about 15 different protocols, but he didn't seem to care. "Ma'am," he said, "I think that ship sailed about 10 minutes ago, but for what it's worth, I'm honored to be the one flying you into whatever comes next." Margaret turned to look back at those 2 F-35s, holding their position in the sky, waiting. And she knew that Captain Richards was right. Her old life was already gone. The only question now was what came after. The first-class cabin had been cleared for her, a detail that Margaret didn't fully register until the flight attendant gently escorted her to seat 1A with a cup of chamomile tea that she suspected had been laced with something slightly stronger than herbs. Richards had made the request to Denver Air Traffic Control, citing a medical situation requiring passenger relocation, and no one had questioned it. Margaret supposed that, when 2 F-35s were escorting your aircraft, air traffic control became surprisingly accommodating about cabin adjustments. She sat alone in the front section, surrounded by empty seats and the weight of everything unsaid. The tea steamed in her hands, untouched. Outside, the F-35s maintained their escort position, visible through the window every time she glanced up from the seat pocket in front of her. Margaret pulled out her phone slowly, like it was a loaded weapon. She hadn't done this in years, decades really. She'd trained herself not to. The psychology of compartmentalization had been reinforced so thoroughly that even looking at her own name in a search engine felt like a violation of operational security, even though she was no longer operational, hadn't been for decades. But now with F-35s outside the window and Admiral Patricia Houston activating some kind of long-dormant protocol, the training felt less important than the truth. She opened a browser with shaking hands. Navy Squadron VF-194, Red Rippers 1976 incident. The results loaded instantly. Wikipedia, military history forums, declassified government documents, academic papers written by historians trying to piece together Cold War operations from fragmentary intelligence. The first result was bold, official, stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense. DECLSSFID, the last dogfight. Margaret felt her chest tighten. The dogfight. As if there was only one that mattered enough to be called the last one. As if what happened on that specific day in December 1976 over the Pacific Ocean was significant enough to still be talked about, still be analyzed, still be remembered by people who weren't even born when it occurred. She clicked the link. The document opened in a PDF format, formatted like an official intelligence briefing. The language was bureaucratic and clinical, designed to rob events of their human content and convert them into data points. In 1976, during a routine training exercise over the Pacific, Navy Squadron VF-194 encountered unexpected Soviet incursions. Initial encounter was classified as unplanned MiG-23 penetration of established naval airspace boundaries. What was officially documented as a mechanical failure, involving 3 F-4 Phantom aircraft, was, for decades, classified as one of the most significant air-to-air engagements of the Cold War period. Margaret's vision blurred slightly. She took a sip of the tea without tasting it. The engagement resulted in the destruction of 2 Soviet MiG-23s via direct air-to-air engagement. Pilot responsible for both confirmed kills was call sign Widow 6, the only female pilot participating in the sortie. This pilot's engagement record represents the highest single sortie kill count by any American naval aviator during the Cold War period. The document contained no name. Of course it didn't. Even now, even declassified, it couldn't name her. She was just a number, a call sign, a statistical anomaly that the government had spent decades trying to suppress. But then she scrolled down. Pilot call sign, Widow 6, executed tactical engagement of superior numbers with exceptional airmanship. Recorded radio communications from the sortie indicate awareness of fuel constraints and mission parameters. Pilot made the decision to engage despite known limitations, prioritizing squadron protection and intelligence objectives over personal survival considerations. Margaret's hands were trembling now. The engagement came at significant cost. 2 American pilots did not return to carrier. 1 ejection sequence initiated but resulted in aircraft loss. 2nd pilot engaged in rescue operation to facilitate intelligence asset recovery. Both pilots, Lieutenant Commander Robert Reaper Mitchell and Lieutenant James Compass Chen, were recovered as KIA killed in action under classified circumstances. She couldn't breathe. Not for the clinical reason that the air in the cabin felt thin. The pressure was fine, the oxygen was adequate. But for the reason that when you read your husband's name alongside the word, KIA, even in a government document written in passive voice designed to strip it of emotional content, your body responds as if you've just been ejected from an aircraft without a parachute. James, her husband, called Compass by his squadron. She'd almost forgotten that part. The way the names worked in that world. The call signs that pilots earned based on some incident or quality or joke that would never be documented, that would exist only in the memory of other pilots who'd understood the shorthand of military aviation humor. Compass, because James had always known where true north was, because he'd had an instinctive sense of direction even in zero visibility conditions, because in the chaos of a combat situation, James Chen would always navigate toward the right decision, even if it cost him everything. Margaret scrolled further. The document contained a timeline, a recreation of the engagement based on declassified radar data and radio intercepts. The Soviet aircraft had come in at 13:47 hours local time. The first engagement had been at 13:51 hours. By 13:56 hours, both MiG-23s had been destroyed. 5 minutes of combat, that's all it had taken. The document noted that 1 F-4, Callsign Widow 6, had sustained minor damage to the vertical stabilizer but maintained flight capability. 2 other F-4s had engaged in secondary tactics, and then came the words that made Margaret's vision go white. At 13:58 hours, Pilot Compass initiated unscheduled descent from formation. Radio communication indicates pilot awareness of fuel limitations in secondary aircraft. Pilot volunteered for unauthorized recovery operation at 13:59 hours, stating taking the package. Someone has to go home to their family. Origin of statement unclear. Context suggests awareness of third-party assets on water. Pilot Compass lost all contact at 14:03 hours. Ejection seat activation was not confirmed. Aircraft debris recovered in search and rescue operation. No survivor recovery possible. No survivor recovery possible. That's what they'd told her at the base the day after. Lieutenant Chen's aircraft went down. We didn't recover any survivors. Clinical, professional. The way you tell someone that their entire life has just shattered into pieces that will never reassemble. She'd asked questions. She demanded answers. And they'd given her classified briefings that explained nothing, security clearances that allowed her to know everything and tell no one, a pension and a new identity and a quiet suggestion that she relocate somewhere far from military installations where people might recognize her. Santa Fe, they'd suggested, a nice town, quiet, you could build a normal life there. And she had. She'd been so good at building that normal life that she'd almost believed in it. But Margaret kept reading, because now that the compartment was breaking open, she couldn't stop the flood. Pilot Widow 6 continued operations until 14:45 hours, providing air cover for secondary recovery assets. Aircraft returned to carrier with minimum fuel reserve. Pilot was debriefed by Admiral Patricia Houston, then Captain, regarding engagement tactical decisions and secondary operation parameters. And then, in a footnote that seemed almost casually inserted, Pilot Widow 6 requested permanent separation from active duty. Request was granted 1977. Pilot's whereabouts and subsequent employment status marked as classified. All subsequent inquiries regarding this pilot are to be directed to the Office of Naval Intelligence. This restriction remains in effect indefinitely. The document ended there, but the internet didn't. Margaret found forum posts from military historians, people who dedicated decades to piecing together Cold War operations from fragmentary evidence. They'd noticed the gap. They'd found the statistical anomaly. They'd created forums dedicated to asking questions about the mysterious female pilot from the 1976 engagement. One forum post was dated from just 3 weeks ago. Does anyone know what happened to Widow 6? The kill record was unprecedented for a single sortie, and then the pilot just vanished from every public record. Why would the Navy keep her so hidden? What's the story that required 47 years of secrecy? The post had 247 replies. Margaret scrolled through them, reading theories that ranged from ridiculous to surprisingly accurate. Some people thought she'd been killed and covered up. Some thought she'd defected. Some thought she'd gone insane and been institutionalized. One commenter had suggested she'd simply chosen to disappear, to walk away from that world and live a normal life. That commenter was closer to the truth than any government document had ever come. She set the phone down with trembling hands. The tea had gone cold. Outside the window, the F-35s maintained their escort. Somewhere in the cockpit, Captain Richards was maintaining altitude, maintaining course, maintaining professional composure while transporting a woman whose entire existence had just been retroactively revealed to contain classified kill records and missing husbands, and 47 years of deliberate erasure. Margaret pressed her forehead against the window, and she whispered something to the F-35s, to the memory of James, to the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but they wouldn't let me grieve you. They wouldn't let me say your name. They wouldn't let me tell Emma who her father was or why he mattered or that he died doing something that was supposed to matter. She closed her eyes. Until now, until those pilots decided to remember. Denver International Airport glowed like a constellation against the winter dusk. Flight 847 descended smoothly through the final approach vectors, the F-35s having peeled away with a final dip of their wings, a salute so precise it could have been choreographed, as they transitioned into civilian airspace. Margaret watched them go from her seat in first class, feeling like she was watching the last thread connecting her to her old identity disappear into the gathering darkness. The landing was perfect. Captain Richards executed it with the kind of professional precision that suggested he was proving something, that despite the chaos of the flight, despite the military jet escort, despite whatever Margaret Chen actually was, he could still land an aircraft like a man who'd spent 32 years perfecting his craft. The 737 touched down at 5:47 p.m. Mountain Time, taxied toward gate B-52, and came to a stop with the usual pneumatic hiss of commercial aviation. Margaret didn't move. The flight attendants were already preparing the cabin, opening overhead bins, retrieving luggage. The businessman who'd sat next to her had long ago returned to his seat, confused and irritated by the disruption. Around her, people were gathering their belongings, checking phones, preparing to rejoin the normal world. She gathered her single carry-on, a small rolling bag that contained everything she'd brought from Santa Fe, and stood on shaky legs. The terminal was crowded with evening arrivals and holiday travelers. Margaret moved through the crowd like a ghost, invisible again, just an elderly woman in a navy jacket navigating toward baggage claim. She was almost starting to believe she could slip back into anonymity, that she could somehow walk away from the F-35s and Admiral Houston and the phone call that had activated the call sign. Widow 6. She turned. The woman standing in front of her was Navy all the way through. Captain Sandra Liu, 45 years old, with steel-gray streaks in her dark hair and shoulder boards that indicated decades of service. Her uniform was dress blues, pristine and official, and her eyes held the kind of steadiness that came from command experience. She saluted Margaret without any of the awkwardness that civilians felt around military protocol. This wasn't a gesture of deference. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of recognition. "Captain Liu," Margaret said, not returning the salute. She'd learned long ago that her role in this world was ambiguous enough that formal military courtesies sometimes made people uncomfortable. "We need to talk," Liu said quietly. "Not here. I have a vehicle waiting in short-term parking. Please come with me." Margaret should have asked questions, should have demanded explanations, should have exercised the skepticism that a rational person would feel about a uniformed Navy officer intercepting her at an airport. But something in Liu's voice, something that suggested she was operating under authority much higher than her rank, made Margaret simply nod and follow. The drive took 20 minutes. Liu navigated Denver's evening traffic with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was thinking about something else entirely. The vehicle was a nondescript sedan government issue with the kind of anonymity that intelligence operatives preferred. They drove in silence, and Margaret watched the city lights reflect off the wet pavement. It had snowed recently, coating everything in white, making the world look temporarily clean. "When did you first know?" Margaret asked finally. Liu kept her eyes on the road. 3 months ago. We were running facial recognition software on commercial flight manifests, routine counterintelligence work, nothing specific to you. But the system flagged a match. A woman matching your physical description, using your legal name, making a domestic flight from Santa Fe. The algorithm assigned it a 98.7% confidence level. That seems high for facial recognition. It would be, except we had baseline data to compare it to. Your entry photograph from 1976, your Naval Academy photos, images from classified briefings that were still in the archives. Once the system had those reference points, it could track you across decades even with age progression factoring in. You became visible again. Liu turned onto a quieter street, lined with older commercial buildings. "We didn't approach you immediately," she continued. "There was protocol to observe, clearances to verify, command structure to consult. Admiral Houston had to authorize the operational approach personally. She spent 6 weeks verifying that you'd remained out of any intelligence community involvement, that you genuinely retired and constructed a civilian life. She wanted to be absolutely certain before we reactivated contact." "Reactivated," Margaret repeated. "That word implies I was dormant, that I was waiting to be activated." "Weren't you?" Liu glanced at her briefly. "Every day you walked the same route. Every day you followed the same routines. Every person I've read who knew you, the library patrons, the church volunteers, your granddaughter, they all said the same thing. You were a good person, a kind person, but always at a distance, always holding something back, always waiting for something. Margaret didn't respond, because Liu was right. They arrived at a nondescript office building on the outskirts of downtown Denver. Liu led her through a side entrance, down a corridor, and into a room that had been set up with secure communications equipment, the kind of facility that the intelligence community maintained in every major city. A table, a window with reinforced glass, and folders, so many folders. "Please sit," Liu said, gesturing to a chair. Margaret sat. Liu opened the first folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a letter, handwritten in Cyrillic script, photographed as archival documentation. "3 months ago," Liu began, "this was delivered to the Pentagon. Hand-delivered by courier, no return address, no way to trace the origin. It arrived at the Office of Naval Intelligence with a single sentence written in English on the envelope." She pointed to the translated text below the photograph. "Widow 6 will be on Flight 847 on December 23rd. Tell her we know what really happened that day in 1976. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. "Who delivered it?" she asked. "Unknown. Could have been hired courier. Could have been direct contact. We traced the envelope to a DHL processing center in Albuquerque, but the security footage showed someone in a baseball cap and sunglasses, deliberately obscured. We've had technicians working on analysis for 3 months. No conclusive identification." "What does someone knowing what really happened mean? The official record is incomplete," Liu interrupted gently. "That's actually why I brought you here, because someone out there is working very hard to make sure you receive a message, and before we intercept them and find out who, you need to understand what gaps they're referring to." She opened a second folder. The official record documents 3 F-4 Phantoms engaged in the December 1976 sortie. It documents 2 Soviet MiG-23s destroyed. It documents 2 American pilots killed. "But ma'am," Liu's voice became very careful, very precise. "The classified files that Admiral Houston authorized me to show you indicate there was a 4th aircraft in that engagement. A 4th pilot. Someone whose call sign never appeared in any official report. Someone whose participation was redacted so thoroughly that even most Navy records don't know he existed." Margaret's mouth was dry. "Who?" she whispered. "That's where it gets complicated," Liu said. She opened a third folder and slid it across the table. Margaret looked at the photograph. It was an old military ID, dated 1975. A handsome man with intense dark eyes and a slight smile. The name underneath was in Cyrillic, Dmitry Volkov, Soviet Naval Aviation. "The 4th pilot was Soviet," Liu said quietly. "And according to our most recent intelligence that came in just 3 weeks ago, he's still alive. He's been alive for 47 years, and he's been asking to meet with you." Margaret stared at the photograph of a dead man who wasn't dead. "Where?" she asked. "About 30 minutes from here," Liu said. "At a veterans hospital. He checked in 6 months ago under an assumed name, but 2 weeks ago he decided to reveal his identity to hospital administration. He requested secure communications, and he asked them to relay a message to the Navy." Liu leaned forward. He said, "Tell them I'm ready to tell the truth. Tell them I want Widow 6 to hear it from me. Tell them I've waited long enough to stop being a ghost." Margaret looked up from the photograph. "Why would he want to meet me?" she asked. "What's changed? Why now after 47 years? Liu's expression became very grave. "Because he's dying, ma'am. His heart is failing. The doctors give him 6 months, maybe a year. And he's decided that if he's going to die, he's not going to die as a secret. He's not going to die as a redacted name in classified files. He's going to die as himself, telling the truth that the government has kept buried since 1976. Liu stood and extended her hand. "The question is, are you ready to hear it? Because once you do, everything changes. Your life, your privacy, your granddaughter's wedding, all of it becomes public record. All of it becomes history. Margaret took her hand and stood. "Take me to him," she said. "I've waited 47 years to know what really happened to my husband. It's time I finally got some answers." The Veterans Hospital was on the northwest side of Denver, a sprawling complex that tried very hard to look welcoming despite being fundamentally a place where people came to confront their own mortality. Captain Liu signed them in at the security desk, her Navy credentials apparently granting her access that would have taken most civilians hours to obtain, and led Margaret through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and institutional resignation. "Room 412, Liu said quietly as they rode the elevator. "He's been expecting you since we confirmed the flight intercept. He hasn't slept. The nurses said he's been awake all night, staring out the window toward the airport like he could see the planes coming in from here." Margaret said nothing. She was trying to prepare herself for something she didn't understand, not a conversation, not a confrontation, but a reckoning with a ghost who'd apparently been alive the entire time she'd been mourning him. The corridor on the fourth floor was quiet, lined with rooms where men and women were spending their final chapters. Through open doorways, Margaret caught glimpses of solitary figures in hospital beds, televisions playing to empty rooms, the small detritus of lives lived and now contained to a single room. Liu stopped in front of 412 and knocked. "Come in," a voice called, accented English, careful pronunciation, the voice of someone who'd spent decades practicing a language that wasn't native to him. The room was small but neat. A window overlooked the Denver skyline, all lights and distance, and in the bed, propped up on pillows, was the man from the photograph. Dmitry Volkov was 85 years old, and he looked like he'd been dying for a very long time. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of something that Margaret couldn't quite identify, not just age, but the kind of erosion that came from carrying a secret that never got lighter. His hair was white, thin, combed carefully back from his forehead. His hands, resting on the hospital blanket, were trembling slightly, whether from medication or emotion Margaret couldn't determine. But his eyes were exactly the same as the photograph, intense, alert, aware. "Widow 6, he said softly, "Margaret Chen. I have waited 47 years to say your name to your face." Margaret stepped into the room. Liu remained in the doorway, professional and discreet, giving them the fiction of privacy while maintaining security. "How are you alive?" Margaret asked. Not a greeting, not a question that acknowledged the emotional weight of the moment. Just the most fundamental question that had been burning in her mind since Liu had shown her the photograph. Dmitry gestured to the chair beside the bed. Margaret sat slowly, maintaining distance, maintaining the professional detachment that had kept her sane for 4 decades. "I am alive because James Chen died," Dmitry said, and the words landed like a physical blow. "I am alive because on December 15, 1976, a young American pilot made a choice that the government has been keeping secret ever since." He paused, gathering strength, gathering breath. "You know the official record. 3 F-4s engaged 2 Soviet MiGs. You and your squadron mates shot down the Soviet aircraft. 2 American pilots died. The end. Closed file, classified, forgotten as much as something like that can be forgotten." "That's what they told me," Margaret said. "That's what they told you because they couldn't tell you the truth without admitting something that would have sparked international incident," Dmitry continued. "You see, Margaret, I may call you Margaret. I was not simply a Soviet pilot stumbling into your airspace. I was a Soviet pilot who had been planning for 6 months to defect to the United States." Margaret's breath caught. "I was going to fly my MiG directly to a U.S. base. I was going to eject over American territory. I was going to surrender my aircraft and my knowledge to your government. But the Soviets, they were suspicious of me. They'd noticed small things, a questioning attitude, books I was reading, contacts I was making, so I needed something that would make my defection look not like defection, but like accident. He coughed, a wet, terrible sound that made a nurse appear in the doorway, check his oxygen levels, and disappear again. I contacted your Navy through a back-channel contact. Took 3 months, but eventually I got through to an Admiral, Patricia Houston. She was captain then, and I said, I need to defect, but it must look like accident. Can you arrange incident during training exercise? And she said yes. She said she could do it. Margaret felt like the room was spinning. They planned it, Dimitri continued. They arranged for our patrol to be in your training zone. They told your pilots what altitude to fly at, what vectors to use. They told me where to position my aircraft to make it look like aggressive incursion. And the plan was simple. I would engage, you would respond, and then I would eject over American water and disappear into military custody before my own government realized I was gone. But something went wrong, Margaret said. Yes, something went catastrophically wrong, Dimitri said, and there were tears streaming down his face now. My ejection was earlier than planned. I came down in a remote area. My parachute caught in rocks. I was injured. And when your squadron mates looked for me, they couldn't find me immediately. The rescue operation took longer than it should have. And James, your James, the one they called Compass, he made a decision. Dimitri closed his eyes. I was listening to the radio. I heard the conversations. I heard your pilots trying to locate me. And I heard James volunteer for something that wasn't in the original plan. He said, I'll take the search grid. Someone has to go home to their family. And then he broke formation and went lower, searching harder, knowing his fuel situation was deteriorating. Margaret's hands were white-knuckled, gripping the chair arms. He found me, Dimitri whispered. He ejected his aircraft so that his parachute could provide cover while I regained my bearings. He guided me to a better position so a rescue helicopter could reach me. And he stayed in the search area too long. He stayed until his fuel was gone. He stayed because he understood that I had a family waiting somewhere, maybe, and someone needed to give me a chance at the life I was trying to build. No, Margaret said. No, the official record says. The official record says he died in a training accident, Dimitri interrupted. But the truth is, James Chen died because he chose to save me. And the government covered it up because admitting that truth would mean admitting that they'd orchestrated an intelligence operation that went wrong. It would mean admitting that they'd sent pilots into a situation without telling them the full truth. It would mean admitting that James Chen was brave enough to die for someone he didn't know, from a country he was supposed to consider enemy. Margaret stood abruptly and walked to the window. The Denver lights blurred through her tears. What happened to you, she asked, after he died? I was debriefed. I was hidden. I was told to forget that James Chen had ever existed. I was given a new identity, a pension, a warning to never speak of what I knew. And I obeyed. For 47 years I obeyed. I lived as a ghost because I had no right to live as myself when the man who saved me was dead. Margaret turned to face him. Why now? Why are you telling me this now? Dimitri's expression became very still, very serious. Because 2 weeks ago, I decided that I would not die as a ghost. I decided that if I was going to leave this world, I was going to leave it as Dmitri Volkov, not as a redacted name in classified files, not as a secret that died with me, as a man who lived because another man chose sacrifice over safety. He looked directly at Margaret. And because you deserve to know the truth, you deserve to know that your husband mattered, that his death wasn't an accident, that it was a choice, the last and most important choice James Chen ever made. Margaret felt something break inside her chest, not a shattering but a breaking open, the way ice breaks when spring finally comes. 47 years of silence, 47 years of not knowing, 47 years of being told that James's death was just one of those tragic things that happened in military service. But it hadn't been tragic, it had been heroic. I'm going to tell the world, Margaret heard herself say, Her voice didn't sound like her own. "I'm going to tell them what really happened. I'm going to tell them who James was. I'm going to make sure his name means something." Dmitri closed his eyes, and for the first time since Margaret had entered the room, he smiled. Not a happy smile, but a smile of profound relief, like a man who'd been holding his breath for nearly 50 years and could finally exhale. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving him back his life." But as Margaret turned toward the door, Captain Liu's expression changed. Her phone had buzzed. She'd read something, and now she was moving toward Margaret with urgency. "Ma'am, we need to move. Immediately. The Pentagon has just declared this location a security breach. Armed agents are being dispatched from the regional field office. We have approximately 5 minutes before this entire hospital goes into lockdown." Sedan cut through Denver traffic with the kind of aggression that suggested Captain Liu had stopped worrying about civilian traffic laws. Margaret gripped the dashboard, her mind fracturing between shock and action, between the weight of what she just learned and the immediate reality that the government was moving against them. "How long?" Margaret asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "They dispatched from the field office 8 minutes ago," Liu said, her eyes locked on the road. "Mountain Interstate is closest route to them. If we can get onto I-25 North before they set up a perimeter, we have maybe a 40-minute window before they coordinate with state police and airport security." "We're going to the airport." "Not yet. We're going to a safe house first. There's a location in the mountains about 30 minutes northwest. Once we're secure, we assess options." Margaret turned to look back at the hospital, receding into the distance. Dmitri was still in that room, still dying, still waiting for permission to become himself, and the government was moving to contain the situation before he could tell his story. "They're going to silence him," Margaret said flatly. "They're going to secure the location, which amounts to the same thing," Liu said grimly. "Once the Pentagon has control of a space, once they've declared it a security breach, everything inside becomes classified again. Dmitri becomes unreachable. Any documentation he was prepared to share becomes evidence in a sealed investigation. And your granddaughter's wedding becomes a footnote in a classified file that no one will see for another 30 years. They drove in tense silence for 15 minutes. Margaret watched the Denver skyline fade and the mountains rise up around them, dark silhouettes against the winter sky. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Grandma, are you here? Mom's having a meltdown about the flowers and I could really use your calm right now." Margaret stared at the message. 3 weeks. Emma was getting married in 3 weeks. And Margaret had just activated a protocol that would make her granddaughter's life subject to public scrutiny and classified investigations, and all the things that came with a family member deciding to blow open a Cold War secret. She texted back, "Running a bit behind on traffic, I'll call you soon." The lie sat in her hands like a stone. "You're thinking about pulling back," Liu said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about my granddaughter," Margaret said. "I'm thinking about the fact that her wedding was supposed to be about her happiness, and instead it's going to become national news. I'm thinking about the fact that my son-in-law is probably going to wake up tomorrow and discover his future wife's grandmother is involved in some kind of classified intelligence operation that's currently being pursued by federal agents." "Those are all valid concerns," Liu said carefully. "They're also secondary to the fact that a classified Cold War operation that resulted in an American pilot's death is being actively suppressed by the Pentagon. That's not a small thing, ma'am. That's a fundamental question about whether the government gets to decide which truths are too inconvenient to acknowledge." "I'm not disagreeing with you philosophically," Margaret said. "I'm trying to reconcile the fact that the right thing to do and the thing that protects my family are now in direct conflict." Liu took an exit that led them into the foothills. The roads became narrower, less traveled. She drove with the kind of confidence that suggested she knew this terrain, that she'd trained for extraction scenarios in real geography. Your husband made a choice, Liu said quietly. He knew the consequences. He knew his fuel situation. He knew the risks. And he did it anyway because he believed some things were worth dying for. Now his death has been secret for 47 years. His sacrifice has been reduced to a footnote in classified files. His daughter grew up thinking he died in a routine accident. And his granddaughter is about to have a wedding where no one in the family will know the truth about where she comes from. She turned to look at Margaret briefly. So the question becomes, do we honor James Chen's sacrifice by letting it stay buried? Or do we honor it by bringing it into the light, even if the light hurts? Margaret didn't answer. She was thinking about Emma, about the look on her face when she realized her great-grandfather's death had been classified. She was thinking about her son-in-law, about the complications that would arise. She was thinking about her own life in Santa Fe, the carefully constructed normalcy that would be shattered. And she was thinking about James, the way he sounded on the radio transmission. Someone has to go home to their family. The safe house was a cabin deep in the mountains, accessible only by a narrow road that looked barely passable in winter. Liu pulled into a garage that was built into the mountainside, and the door closed behind them with a mechanical finality. Inside, it was equipped like a temporary command center. Encrypted communication equipment, a laptop with secure connections, a refrigerator stocked with supplies, windows facing the mountain landscape with views in multiple directions. The kind of place that intelligence operatives used when they needed to disappear but still needed to operate. We have perhaps 6 hours before the Pentagon escalates this to the point where local law enforcement becomes involved, Liu said, moving to the secure computer. In that time, we have several options. She pulled up a secure messaging system. Option 1. Dimitri's testimony goes public before they can contain it. I have contacts at NPR, The Washington Post, Reuters. If we coordinate the release of classified documents along with Dimitri's recorded statement, we get the story out before the Pentagon can institute a media blackout. It becomes much harder to suppress something that's already in the public domain. How long would that take? 2 hours to coordinate, 4 hours to vet and publish, 6 hours total before it hits major news outlets. And option 2. We disappear, Liu said simply. You, Dimitri if he's mobile, and myself. We coordinate with allies in Canada, maybe Sweden, countries with strong intelligence communities that aren't beholden to the Pentagon. We offer the story to international media. It becomes a geopolitical incident rather than a domestic security breach. Makes it much harder for the U.S. government to suppress. How long? Longer, 24 to 48 hours to establish secure passage and coordinate international media. But it has the advantage of putting you outside U.S. jurisdiction before they can move against you. Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the dark mountains. Somewhere out there, agents were coordinating. Somewhere out there, Dimitri was waiting to see if he'd get to be himself or if he'd die as a secret. Somewhere out there, Emma was texting her mother about wedding flowers, with no idea that her grandmother was about to change everything. Call Admiral Houston, Margaret said finally. Liu looked up from the computer. Ma'am. Call Admiral Houston directly. Secure line. I want to speak with her before we do anything else. I want to understand what changed. Why she decided to activate Widow 6 now. Why she authorized this contact. Because something doesn't add up. The Pentagon wouldn't be moving this aggressively to suppress a 47-year-old secret unless something had changed. Unless there was something else. Liu's expression shifted. Respect mixed with recognition that Margaret was thinking operationally. Thinking like someone who'd once been trained for this. You're right, Liu said. She moved to the secure communications equipment and began entering authentication codes. There's something else, something we haven't discussed yet. The encrypted line connected, and Admiral Patricia Houston's voice came through the speaker, older than Margaret remembered, but carrying the same calm authority that had characterized her as a captain. "Widow 6, Houston said. "I've been expecting your call. I assume Captain Liu has explained the situation." "She has," Margaret said, "but I don't think she's explained why. Why now? Why activate me after 47 years? What changed?" There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause that preceded admissions of things that had been classified so high that even retired admirals carried them carefully. "3 months ago," Houston said finally, "we received intelligence that someone had accessed the classified files related to the 1976 engagement. Someone with high-level clearance. Someone inside the intelligence community. They read everything. And then they disappeared. But before they disappeared, they made sure someone got the message to you." "Who?" Margaret asked. "That's the problem," Houston said. "We don't know, but whoever they are, they want you to know the truth. They want Dimitri's story to come out, and they're willing to risk their entire career, possibly their freedom, to make that happen." "Why would someone do that?" "Because," Houston said quietly, "James Chen was their father." Margaret felt the world tilt. "He had a child," she whispered. "Before he married me, I never—" "Not before," Houston interrupted. "After. A child he didn't know about. A woman who grew up not knowing who her father was, and who, 3 months ago, found the classified files and decided that her father deserved to be remembered as more than a statistical anomaly." "Where is she?" Margaret asked. "That's the real problem," Houston said. "She's missing, and if the Pentagon finds her before we do, they're going to charge her with espionage, and she's going to spend the rest of her life in federal prison for trying to give her father his name back." Silence that followed Admiral Houston's revelation stretched across the secure line like a physical weight. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the idea that James, her James, the man she'd buried 47 years ago, had fathered a child she'd never known existed. "Explain," Margaret said finally, her voice hollow. "In 1975, before you met him, James was involved with a woman named Catherine Morrison. It was brief, serious at the time, but ultimately not meant to be. When Catherine found out she was pregnant, she made the decision not to tell James. She wanted to build a life that wasn't entangled with military service, wasn't entangled with the complications of an aviator's commitments. She raised their daughter alone, named her Sarah, never told her who her father was." Margaret felt something inside her fracturing. Another woman, another life James had lived that she'd never known about. "Catherine died 10 years ago," Houston continued. "Cancer. And when she did, Sarah found some of Catherine's journals, letters that Catherine had written but never sent, letters explaining who Sarah's father was, what he did, why Catherine had chosen to keep them apart. Sarah became obsessed with finding out more. She joined the Navy herself, got clearance, worked her way into positions where she could access classified files. And she found the 1976 engagement documentation," Margaret said. "And she found everything," Houston confirmed. "She found the details of the operation. She found Dmitry Volkov's name. She found the declassified protocols that explained what really happened to her father. And 3 months ago, when she had all the pieces together, she made a decision. She was going to tell the world who her father was. But the Pentagon stopped her. Before we could stop her, she'd already moved the files. She'd already made contact with Dmitry. She'd already arranged for the message to reach you. And then she disappeared, went dark, left her post, abandoned her identity, and went aground somewhere we haven't been able to locate." Margaret sank into a chair beside the secure communications terminal. Captain Liu was watching her carefully, professionally, but there was something almost like sympathy in her expression. "How old is she?" Margaret asked. 46. A daughter of James's who was now older than James had been when he died. A woman who'd spent her entire life searching for a father whose existence had been classified away from her. A woman who'd broken federal law because she believed her father deserved to be remembered. Do you think she's involved in contacting Dmitri, in arranging the intercept? Margaret asked. We think she contacted Dmitri approximately 6 weeks ago, Houston said. She arranged for his medical transfer to the Denver facility. She set up the infrastructure for today's events. She's been orchestrating this entire situation. And ma'am, she did it because she believes that your husband's sacrifice deserves acknowledgement. She did it because she wants her father to be more than a classified footnote. What will happen to her if this goes public? Margaret asked. The pause was answer enough. She will be charged with espionage, Houston said finally. Theft of classified documents, breach of the Espionage Act, multiple counts of unauthorized disclosure. If she's convicted on all charges, she'll serve 30 years minimum, possibly life. Margaret's hands were shaking. So the choice is, we expose the truth about James, we honor his sacrifice, we give Dmitri his final gift of being himself, and in doing so, we send Sarah Chen to prison for the rest of her life. Is that what you're telling me? That's the situation as it stands, Houston said. Unless we find her first, unless we can negotiate with the Pentagon for immunity in exchange for her surrender and cooperation, unless we can convince federal prosecutors that her actions were driven by a desire for historical truth rather than malicious intent. Can you do that? I can try, Houston said. I have some leverage, but leverage requires information I don't have. It requires knowing where Sarah is. It requires her cooperation. And it requires time we don't have because the Pentagon's security protocols are being escalated as we speak. Margaret stood and began packing the small cabin. Her mind was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. The operational level where she understood the intelligence calculus, the emotional level where she was processing the existence of a stepdaughter she'd never known, and the moral level where she was trying to reconcile what was right with what was possible. She contacted you, Margaret said suddenly. Before she went dark, before the Pentagon started looking for her, she had to have left some way to be reached, some protocol, some dead drop or secure communication line or… We don't know, Houston interrupted. We've been searching her known associates, her financial records, her digital footprint. She's completely dark. Whoever trained her, whoever she's working with, they've done an excellent job of keeping her hidden. Then she trained someone, or someone trained her, Margaret said. Someone with intelligence community experience. Someone who understands compartmentalization and operational security well enough to hide someone from the Pentagon's resources. Liu was standing now, understanding where Margaret's logic was leading. You're thinking she might make contact with you, Liu said. If she knows you're activated, if she knows her plan is coming to fruition, she might reach out. She reached out through the encrypted message about the flight, Margaret said. She's been watching the operation unfold. She knows about the F-35 intercept. She knows about Dmitri. She's monitoring events in real time, which means she's going to contact me. She has to. I'm the only person who can give her what she wants, acknowledgement that James Chen mattered, that he was a good father even if he never knew she existed. Margaret moved to the window and looked out at the dark mountains. Somewhere out there, Sarah Chen was watching, waiting, hoping that her elaborate operation would finally bring her father's name into the light. We need to offer her a deal, Margaret said. Before the Pentagon finds her, before we go public with the story, we use her as leverage. We tell the Justice Department that if they want the classified files, if they want the truth about the 1976 engagement, they have to grant Sarah immunity. Full immunity. No charges. No prosecution. In exchange for her surrender and her cooperation in declassifying everything. They won't accept that, Houston said immediately. The Pentagon will argue national security. They'll argue that precedent matters. They'll argue that you can't let people break the law just because they have emotional reasons for doing so. Then we make it impossible for them to refuse, Margaret said. We release everything simultaneously. Dimitri's testimony, The classified files. Sarah's confession about why she did it. We make it so public, so visible, that the only way the Pentagon can contain it is by prosecuting James Chen's own daughter for trying to give him his name back. And we make sure that every major news outlet in the country understands that narrative before the Pentagon moves. Liu was already moving to the secure computer. I can get the documents released within the hour, she said. Reuters, AP, NPR, Post, I have contacts at all of them. We coordinate a simultaneous release. It hits social media at the same time. It goes global before anyone can contain it. And Sarah, Margaret asked. We send her a message, Margaret said. Through the same channel she used to contact the hospital. We tell her that we're going public with everything. We tell her that the Pentagon will have a much harder time prosecuting her once this is international news. And we tell her that she has one chance to come forward, tell her story, and negotiate immunity from a position of strength rather than weakness. Houston's voice came through the speaker, and there was something different in her tone now. Not approval exactly, but recognition. You're thinking like an operational commander, Widow 6. You're assessing assets, calculating leverage, planning contingencies. It's been 47 years since you've done this. It's been 47 years since I had a reason to, Margaret said quietly. But I do now. I have a daughter-in-law I never knew existed who's about to destroy her life because she believed her father deserved better than silence. And I have a granddaughter whose wedding is about to become the most important historical moment in Cold War intelligence history. And I have a man dying in a hospital bed who spent 4 decades as a ghost because my husband chose to save him. She turned from the window to face Liu. Let's burn it all down, Margaret said. But we do it in a way that protects Sarah. That's the condition. We don't expose the truth about James Chen without ensuring that his daughter doesn't pay the price for wanting him to be remembered. Liu picked up the secure phone and was already dialing contacts, moving into operational mode. Houston was speaking quietly, coordinating with other officers, activating networks that Margaret hadn't even known still existed. And Margaret stood in the center of the cabin, feeling something shift inside her. The woman she'd been for 47 years, quiet, careful, invisible, was disappearing, and something else was rising up to take her place. Something that remembered what it felt like to be Widow 6, something that understood that some truths were worth fighting for, some sacrifices were worth honoring, some silences were worth breaking. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Widow 6, I'm Sarah, I'm his daughter, and I need your help to bring him home. Margaret stared at the message. Where are you? She typed back. The response came immediately. Closer than you think, and I have something the Pentagon will kill to recover, documents that make everything else look small. Are you ready to finish what my father started? Liu looked up from the computer, phone still to her ear. They've found her, Liu said, reading from her secure terminal. Or she's found us. Satellite imagery shows a vehicle moving toward this location. ETA approximately 12 minutes. Is it Pentagon? Margaret asked. No, Liu said, her expression grim. But it's not friendly either. Someone else just activated a protocol. Someone who's been monitoring this situation. Someone who doesn't want the truth coming out. Who? Margaret demanded. That's the real problem, Liu said. We don't know, but they're armed, they're coordinated, and they're moving very fast. Outside the cabin, the mountains had gone completely dark. And somewhere in that darkness, 3 separate forces were converging on a single location. The Pentagon, hunting for Sarah. Her allies trying to get her to safety. And something else, something that had been hidden in the classified files for 47 years, waiting for the moment when the truth threatened to come out. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. The climax was beginning. The vehicle pulled up to the cabin at 11:53 p.m., and what emerged was not Pentagon agents in tactical gear, but a single figure in a Navy peacoat. A woman with dark hair and James Chen's eyes, carrying a laptop case and moving with the careful precision of someone who'd spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Sarah Chen. Margaret watched from the window as Captain Liu moved to the door, hand on her sidearm out of habit more than actual threat. Sarah raised her hands, unarmed, unthreatening, and nodded once, a gesture of mutual recognition between two military operatives. "Widow 6, Sarah said as she entered the cabin, her voice carrying the same measured calm that Margaret remembered from James's radio transmissions. "I'm Sarah, and I've brought what they're hunting for." She set the laptop case on the table with reverent care. "Everything," Sarah continued. "The original 1976 engagement recordings, the declassified briefings, the intelligence assessments about Dmitry Volkov's defection, the correspondence between Admiral Houston and Soviet back-channel contacts, the medical reports showing that my father," her voice cracked slightly, and she paused to recover, "showing that my father was running on fumes when he made his final decision. I have all of it. And I have something else. Proof that the Pentagon has been actively suppressing this information for 47 years. That there were at least 4 different declassification reviews that recommended releasing these files, and each time the Office of the Secretary of Defense blocked it." Liu was already opening the case, examining the drive, nodding with the grim appreciation of someone recognizing genuine intelligence assets. "How long has it been since you accessed these?" Liu asked. 63 days, Sarah said. "I've been running since then. I have approximately 7 minutes before the Pentagon's electronic tracking systems locate this cabin. I have approximately 3 minutes before the local field office receives confirmation of my position and initiates tactical extraction protocols." Margaret stepped forward and looked at the woman who was James's daughter, really looked at her. The set of her jaw, that was James, the intensity in her eyes, that was his too, but the determination, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a principle, that might have been something else entirely. "How much of this is your choice?" Margaret asked, "and how much was you being manipulated by someone else?" Sarah's expression flickered with something like respect. "Both," she said honestly. "I made the choice to access the files. I made the choice to contact Dmitry, but I had help. Someone inside the intelligence community who believed, who still believes, that this truth mattered more than security protocols. Someone who coached me, who taught me how to hide, who set up the infrastructure for today." "Who?" Liu demanded. "Someone you'll recognize when you read the files," Sarah said. "Someone whose name appears in the classified documents as the original intelligence officer who opposed the cover-up. Someone who spent 47 years waiting for someone to care enough to tell the truth." Outside, the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the mountain air. "Time's up," Liu said grimly. She moved to the secure communications equipment and hit a series of switches. "I'm uploading everything now, every document, every file. Simultaneous release to Reuters, AP, Washington Post, NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera. Release time, 5 minutes. "They'll try to stop it," Sarah said. "They can't," Liu replied. "Once it's in the distribution queues of major international news organizations, the only way to suppress it is to shut down the internet. And they're not authorized to do that. Not yet anyway." Margaret moved to Sarah and took her hand. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew," Margaret said, "and I want you to know that before everything changes. He made a choice to save someone he didn't know, and he did it without hesitation, without doubt, because that's who he was." Sarah's eyes were wet now, the operational composure cracking just slightly. "I was angry at him for so long," Sarah said, "angry that he was never there. Angry that my mother couldn't tell me the truth. But when I read the files, when I understood what he did, when I saw his name in the context of actual sacrifice." She stopped, gathering herself. "I realized he gave me the greatest gift he could have. He showed me that some things matter more than personal safety. Some truths matter more than self-preservation. The helicopter was directly overhead now, searchlights illuminating the cabin. Liu was monitoring the upload progress on her secure terminal. 3 minutes, she said. Files are in the distribution queues. Reuters has confirmed receipt. Washington Post is staging. NPR is checking authenticity. What happens to us, Sarah asked, after this goes public? You surrender, Margaret said firmly. You turn yourself in to federal custody. You cooperate fully with the declassification process, and you become the face of the truth. A Navy officer who broke federal law because her father deserved to be remembered. That narrative is more powerful than any security argument the Pentagon can make. They'll still prosecute, Sarah said. Probably, Margaret agreed. But you won't go to prison, not with the kind of public pressure that's about to come down, not with news cycles running non-stop about a woman who sacrificed her career because she believed in honoring her father's sacrifice. The Pentagon can't afford the political cost. Liu's terminal chimed. Reuters is publishing, Liu said. Story hitting the wires in 3, 2, 1, live. The headline flashed across secure news feeds. DECLSSFID. Navy cover-up exposed. Female pilot sacrifice hidden for 47 years. Within seconds, the story was cascading through every major news outlet in the world. Images of James Chen in his Naval Academy dress whites. Photographs of the 1976 engagement. Dmitry Volkov's medical records. The testimony that would be broadcast within hours. His voice explaining what really happened that day in 1976. The doors of the cabin burst open, and federal agents in tactical gear surrounded them with weapons drawn. On your knees now, a voice commanded. But Liu was holding up her hands peacefully, and Margaret understood. They weren't being arrested. They were being contained. Because outside the cabin, every major news organization in the world had just published a story that made suppressing this situation impossible. The epilogue 3 months later. Emma's wedding took place on March 22nd in a small chapel in Denver, and it was both exactly what she'd wanted and completely transformed by what had happened in the months leading up to it. Margaret walked down the aisle wearing her navy dress whites, the uniform she hadn't worn in 47 years, pressed and cleaned, hanging on her frame like it was greeting an old friend. Behind her came Sarah Chen, also in dress whites, escorted by Admiral Patricia Houston, and in the front row, in a wheelchair pushed by a hospice nurse, sat Dmitry Volkov, dying but present, witnessing the moment when the sacrifice he'd been saved for finally meant something. Emma looked radiant. She cried during the vows, not just from emotion about her fiancé, but from the knowledge of her family history, from understanding that her great-grandfather had been a hero, that her grandmother had broken 47 years of silence to honor him, that sacrifice and courage ran through her bloodline in ways she'd never known. The reception was held at the Denver Art Museum, and it was unlike any wedding reception that had ever occurred. Military officers mingled with journalists. Intelligence community officials stood awkwardly beside documentary filmmakers, and everywhere people were talking about James Chen, about his choice, about what it meant. Sarah stood with Margaret and looked out at the crowd. The charges were dropped, Sarah said quietly. The Justice Department announced it this morning, full immunity, in exchange for complete cooperation with the declassification review. I know, Margaret said. She'd been the one to coordinate with the federal prosecutors. She'd been the one to make the argument that Sarah Chen had committed her crime out of a desire to honor rather than harm. What will you do, Margaret asked, now that you're free? Finish what my father started, Sarah said. Admiral Houston has offered me a position in the Navy's Intelligence Review Board. It's a civilian role, no active duty, but it means I can spend the next decades making sure that other classified sacrifices don't stay buried, that other families don't have to wait 47 years to know the truth about their loved ones. Margaret placed a hand on her stepdaughter's shoulder. "James would have been proud of you," she said. "James would have been proud of you," Sarah replied, "for having the courage to break your silence." Across the reception hall, Dmitri was speaking with a documentary filmmaker, recounting the events of December 15, 1976, his voice still strong despite the advanced cancer that had finally reached his heart. He would die 2 weeks later, having lived long enough to see his story told, long enough to know that the man who saved him had been remembered. Late in the evening, Margaret stepped outside onto the museum's terrace and looked out at the Denver skyline. Her granddaughter was happy. Her daughter, Sarah's half-sister, was processing the fact that she had a sibling she'd never known. The world knew the truth. The classified file had become a historical document, and James Chen's name was no longer a secret. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Veteran story, INSPIRES new legislation on declassification TIMLINES. Congress 2, debate CHENACT, which would mandate automatic release of certain classified documents after 25 years. Emma found her there, still in her wedding dress, the veil long removed. "Thank you, Grandma," Emma said, taking her hand, "for bringing him home, for making sure that great-grandfather James was more than just a name in a classified file." Margaret squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "He made a choice to save someone he didn't know," Margaret said. "I just made a choice to honor that sacrifice. It took me 47 years to find the courage, but I'm glad I did." A year later, the Smithsonian Institution unveiled a new exhibit on Cold War intelligence operations. At its center was a photograph of James Chen in his flight suit, standing in front of an F-4 Phantom, smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from doing exactly what you were meant to do. Next to it was another photograph, Margaret in her widow's 6-call sign, taken just months before that final engagement. The placard beneath read, "Lieutenant James Compass Chen, 1940-91976, someone has to go home to their family." His final words, spoken as he made the choice to save another pilot's life. His sacrifice was classified for 47 years. This exhibit honors his memory and the courage it took for his widow to finally tell his story. And underneath, in smaller text, "In remembrance of all those whose sacrifices were classified away, may we honor them by refusing to let truth stay buried." Margaret stood in front of the exhibit with Sarah beside her, and they were no longer invisible, no longer secret, no longer ghosts. They were finally fully remembered. And that memory, that acknowledgement that James Chen mattered, that would echo forward through decades, through Emma's children, through Sarah's work in declassification reform, through the Chen Act that would eventually change how the government handled classified information. The cost of truth was high, but the cost of silence, Margaret had learned, was higher still. And